Hey everyone, and welcome to Risky Business, your weekly information security news and current affairs show. My name's Patrick Gray. On this week's show, we're going to hear from Jennifer Bisegli, the CEO of Interos Solutions, a company that recently prepared a report on supply chain security for the US government's US-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Risky Business contributor Brian Donahue caught up with Jennifer to talk about the report and really get an idea of what supply chain risks look like from a macro level. The long and the short of it is the supply chain is already very, very opaque, and companies and governments will have to work pretty hard to mitigate the risks involved. Hear that interview coming up after this week's news. This week's show is brought to you by NetSparker, a web application security scanning toolmaker. NetSparker was founded about 9 years ago by this week's sponsor guest, Faru Mavatuna. He was a pen tester who created NetSparker to help him with his own work, but just recently they raised a bundle of cash, $40 million in a Series A round. We'll catch up with him this week and find out if a web app scanning company with $40 million is like the mule with the spinning wheel. But he's actually got some plans there and an interesting vision of taking this tech from being a niche and making it more of a staple. And we haven't seen this sort of money being raised by a comparable company, so it's definitely an interesting chat. All of that is coming up later, but first up, of course, it is time for a check of the week's security news with our good friend Adam Boileau. And Adam, some BGP shenanigans on the internet this week, and there's a write-up here from Dan Gooden over at Ars Technica, but I got to say, I'm a little fuzzy on the details about what actually happened here. Can you walk me through it?
So the story appears to go that persons unknown owned an ISP in Ohio called eNet, got into their BGP system somehow, either through whatever interface they used to manage it, or actually on the routers themselves, and then advertised a bunch of addresses that were part of Amazon's Route 53 DNS service, and then they used that to reroute DNS queries. Answered DNS queries for a bunch of stuff. We don't really know what. The main one that we've seen talked about so far is some kind of Ethereum wallet service called myetherwallet.com. Anyway, they answered DNS requests for myetherwallet.com, redirected it to a web server under their control, and then stole a bunch of ether. They apparently, despite, doing fairly, I guess, sophisticated BGP hijacking. Maybe it's not that sophisticated, but BGP hijacking is not your average thing. Anyway, despite doing that, they didn't actually bother getting a Let's Encrypt cert for myetherwallet.com, the fake one. They just served it with a self-signed cert, and they made off with not very much Ethereum.
Yeah, I think it was 150K, but the wallet address that they sent this ether to already had 17 million in it. So they have a bit of cash. Either that or they were just topping up some rando's wallet. And, there's a few people positing that this whole thing was this whole My Ether wallet thing was a bit of a diversion from the real target or purpose of this BGP hijacking.
Which is not unreasonable. I mean, obviously lots of stuff uses Route 53, and I don't know that this particular hijack propagated particularly far from this Ohio ISP, but yeah, I mean, absolutely they could have jacked anything else that's being resolved through Route 53, and, the amount of money involved doesn't seem like it would have been. I mean, if you were going to do this, you would think you would do it properly and make big bank out of it if stealing ether was your goal. And yeah, the idea of that it's a plausible cover story for something else, or a test of the capability or whatever else. Yeah,
or it could just be people who hack funny, you know what I mean?
It could just be people who aren't very good at hacking. Like, they're good at networking, they're not very good at web server config. It's entirely believable.
But I mean, doing a BGP, people think PGP jacking is hard. But I mean, once you're there, all you need to do is announce a more specific route, and off it goes.
Yeah, I mean, actually doing the BGP hijack is not necessarily the complicated bit. It's handling what happens after you hijack it. Handling the traffic successfully. Like, if you want to do it man in the middle, you want to route it onwards, then you have to have a bit of plumbing in place. And then the second thing is, everybody looks at BGP like it's not a thing you're necessarily going to get away with.
Yeah, it's not stealthy.
In the sense that, it will be observed and people will notice it, and then, whether that leads to any consequences for it is another story. But yeah, it's just not the world's most stealthy thing. And if you're going to do it, you would imagine that you would do it for a good reason.
Still, 150K, I mean, that's more than most people in the world earn in a year, like by far.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. But then again, if you've got $17 million worth of ether already, it's not that much. But then again, as you say, it might be something else. So
I got to say, though, there's a couple of people saying that, there's a Russia connection because there was a Russian server involved. But, if I was a Russian attacker, the last place I'm going to put that server is going to be Russia. Whereas on the other hand, if I'm based in, Australia, the US or UK or Canada, like a Five Eyes country, of course I'm going to use a server in Russia because, they're the least likely country to cough up info related to any investigation. So I got to say, people saying this as a Russia angle, I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the comment sections on the stories about this have been very, we should throw Russia off the internet and, why Russians, which, that's not really much attribution to base that on, I don't think.
No. Bad take alert. Google. Now, look, speaking of bad takes, my take last week was a shocker. We were talking about the Telegram thing and about how, the Russian government had just started blocking Google and Amazon addresses because Telegram was domain fronting through their infrastructure. And I said, well, good luck with that approach because I don't think that's really going to work. But Google blinked and they have disabled domain fronting across their infrastructure. Funnily enough, they've written it up as like, oh, well, you could only ever do domain fronting because of a quirk in our infrastructure. And I'm thinking, going through the hoops to make sure that a HTTP header matches an SNI field is like... That sounds like work. It doesn't sound like you're fixing a quirk. It sounds like you're actively engineering to stop domain fronting. But my understanding of this stuff clearly is not going to be as good as yours. What do you think of that?
I think you certainly have a point. Like it's easier to have your infrastructure be frontable in this way probably than it is to stop it. But then again, Google's, front end is pretty complicated and who knows what sort of madness is going on in their HTTP routing later, all their load balancing and all the TLS. They do have a complicated front end and, you talk to any Google SREs and they've got opinions about it. So, I guess I'm willing
Sounds
to
like you've had a few
that,
conversations with them over maybe a couple of years. But anyway, continue.
I know. I'm willing to believe that it's, I don't think it was intended behavior of their infrastructure to do it. And obviously making it not do it might have been, a thing they do for other reasons. But whether or not it's a thing that we would see them turn on as a specific feature. Now that it's kind of been pushed to the fore of the debate, whether or not they would then, do it explicitly, I guess is another thing we'll have to wait and see. But I'm obviously, you can still front through other options, Amazon, being the one that Telegram is using as well, but
for how long, right? So that's the thing.
Exactly.
When we've seen Google blink, and you'd have to think Amazon's next because they want to maintain a presence in countries like Russia.
Well, yeah,
but I'm not even sure if they do much business in Russia. I'm not even sure if their customers do much business in Russia. But you take my point, right? Like this is an interesting development because domain fronting is extremely important to censorship circumvention. Very important.
And it's also super useful for attackers that want to evade, proxy controls as they egress the network.
This is true. Yeah, this is also true. But we'll keep an eye on that one. Oh, now, it was breaking as I was cutting together last week's show, but there's been this teenager charged in Nova Scotia over downloading Freedom of Information documents from the Canadian government, but because they were doing it via some wget script that was pulling them as direct objects. It was like directly...
Hacking.
Yeah, right?
Only hackers use wget.
Exactly. So they've raided him and charged him with a bunch of stuff. And of course, the reaction from the security community has been pretty swift and damning, saying, what are you doing? I think one of the CISOs or CIOs or someone quite senior in the Canadian government who was involved in this wrote a post on LinkedIn where they're saying the public doesn't have all the information and the media is sensationalizing this, but then he doesn't give us any more information. So I'm like, well, you're going to have to do better than that, buddy, because on the surface of it, this looks like a ridiculous stitch-up.
Yeah, certainly as reported, it seems ridiculous to charge this kid for, incrementing a number in a URL to get documents that were essentially public, except for a few that weren't, because their system permitted it. It doesn't... Yeah, it does not seem like he ought to be facing... And
he's been charged with unauthorized use of a computer.
Yeah, and facing years? 9 years?
Up to 10 years. Yeah, so...
Up to 10 years, which just doesn't seem reasonable. I don't know. Maybe we don't know the whole story, but it's certainly, as reported so far, it seems thoroughly unfair, and we hope that there will be some sense later on in the process.
Look, I'm sticking with your line on this to 100%, which is, as reported, this seems absolutely insane. There might be things that we don't know, but until we hear what those are, I mean, they're going to be pushing it uphill to make me, and I'm guessing you, believe that this is a, indictable, jailable offense, right? If you publish information to the internet and the only thing protecting that information is, relying on someone not incrementing a URL, you're just doing it wrong. And,
Yeah, and I mean, especially when the information in question is essentially meant to be public, except for some exceptions which the system doesn't enforce. And how are you supposed to know in advance whether or not the document is public?
Well, the kid apparently he's like a hoarder, right? So he's got like 30 terabytes of information on his home network, and he just wanted to he says he just wanted to pull down this information so he could offline search it. Maybe he's been doing other naughty things, and this is the thing they could pin on him. We don't know, but until we find out, a bit sus on that. Now, of course, we covered earlier, I think it was earlier this year, wasn't it? The Atlanta ransomware situation. Apparently, and this is really interesting, this is a report on Wired.com that says they spent $2.6 million. This is the government in Atlanta spent $2.6 million instead of, to recover from this ransomware attack, instead of the $52,000 that they could have just paid in the ransom.
Which, I guess if you're a ratepayer or whoever pays the bills in the city of Atlanta, I'm not sure, I guess, you might realistically go, well, this does seem a little bit out of whack, but, I mean, paying the ransom is just not, even it may be a technical option, to get your data back if you're really stuck, but the fact that someone can ransomware you probably means that there's a whole bunch of other stuff wrong in your environment. A whole bunch of other people are up in it as well. If someone's in a position to ransomware you, they're also in a position to take domain admin and own the rest of your environment. And in that context, maybe $2.6 million worth of incident response. Well, was it $600K worth of incident response to Instant Young plus, the rest of the time reinstalling a whole load of boxes, I'm sure, probably is money well spent. You were going to have to do it eventually, when you didn't have the option of paying a ransom because, you'd been, destroyed by something that didn't have a ransom out clause. So,
Adam, this is outrageous. We expect knee-jerk reactions on this show, and you're being way too understanding and, getting into the nuance of the situation. Your career in punditry will be severely...
I should have gone for the quick, cheesy take. Yeah, you're right.
They should have paid it. This is a waste of government money. Rah, rah, rah.
Yeah.
What they could have done is hire some external IT contractor to fix it, like this organization, Harrington, who contracted a group called Proven Data Recovery when they got ransomwared, and PDR did an amazing job, Adam.
Yes, apparently they were able to completely recover the data that had been encrypted by ransomware and do so for quite a modest fee. Modest fee in question being remarkably similar to the amount of money you had to pay the ransom. It turns out they just paid the ransom, decrypted it, and then pretended that they'd, taken care of it, which, I guess they did.
Value adding, mate. Value adding. It's all about adding value. But that was getting some chuckles on the old Twitters. Now, we got a piece here from Cyberscoop that has, they kind of buried the lead on this one, I think. The headline here is nation-state hackers attempted to use Equifax vulnerability against DoD NSA, official says. But, you get a few paragraphs into it, and we got some quotes here saying that, from NSA, saying they haven't responded to an intrusion that's used a zero-day vulnerability in over 2 years. And that has really kicked off a bunch of discussion about so-called cyber hygiene, right? So some people saying, well, look, basic cyber hygiene would have taken care of most of the attacks that they were responding to. And then other people saying, the cyber hygiene concept is bullshit because all that means is the attackers, just kick up and jump over whatever hurdles that you put in place. They didn't use ODay because they didn't have to, that sort of thing. So it's been a bit of an interesting discussion here. And I've kind of got a foot in both camps, which is, you should absolutely do the basics. But just thinking that doing the basics is going to prevent, intrusions by foreign intelligence services is a tad naive.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right on both counts. The basics absolutely do matter. And there's a whole class of attackers where they have one particular bug and they want to find someone to own with it. They don't really care who, right? And then their job is to pick anyone they can own with whatever bug they happen to have and then find a way to, monetize or leverage or do whatever it is that motivates them with that. And basic hygiene saves you from that class of attacker. But if you're being targeted, it just means they're going to have to find something else to hack you with. And there's always something else, and maybe it doesn't have to be, easy peasy Java bugs like Equifax. It's not just off the shelf, struts.py and shell falls out. Okay, fine. You take that away from me. I'm going to find something else. And so, there are absolutely valid points on both camps. And it's once again, as with, any discussion where it comes into threat modeling of what the capabilities and the intent of your attacker are, right? And, it's great to not get owned by drive-by malware.
I think the headline on this Cyberscoop piece really should have been foreign intelligence services have not needed to use O'Day against us, and that's embarrassing.
Yes, that would be a much more accurate and useful headline. Yes.
To me, that's what cuts to the core of this issue. But link in the show notes if anyone wants to have a read of that piece. RSA conference getting a lot of attention for kind of the wrong reasons. Of course, it happened last week in San Francisco, and instead of giving you a map these days, apparently you can install an app, a handy app that will guide you around the gargantuan conference floor. And someone took a screen grab of the permissions this app wants, and oh my God.
Apparently it would like, amongst other things, access to your flashlight, which is really important. I guess if the lights go out at the conference center, then it can automatically turn on the flashlight for you. But yeah, I mean, access to your camera and location and storage and your calendar and reading your contacts, everything.
Well, your contacts, that's a big one, right? Like, because you're thinking, with most apps that just go, YOLO, I want contacts, you think, it's probably not actually going to touch them. But this kind of app at a marketing event, you'd have to be mad to install this app.
Yeah, you would. And I guess this is just what happens when, you end up outsourcing the stuff to a company that, really has no specialty in security. I'm assuming that a third party, company that makes apps for conferences, just customize it for RSA and then ship it out. And there's no actual security involved. And this is, of course, not the only complaint we saw with this particular app. So the same app had a bunch of hard-coded creds, and one of those creds exposed was used to communicate with the web service, and on the web service was a SQLite database that contained a whole bunch of details about people at the conference. And so that was not exactly what you want in a security conference. But yes, lots of people had a lot of fun, making fun of RSA on Twitter, and frankly, they kind of deserve it. If you're going to run a security con, then you best understand your supply chain and make sure everyone is doing a competent job. Otherwise, you're going to look like fools, and they do.
The SEC has fined what's left of Yahoo, the so-called Altaba company. They've fined them $35 million for failing to disclose their breach. And I'm sure they'll just go get that $35 million from their spare pants and continue to operate horrible, horrible web services that leak data everywhere.
Well, there's not much left of there, isn't it? Because this is just the corpse of Yahoo, and that actually sold its real Yahoo to Verizon, and this is just the hull. I don't know if they have any web services anymore, but I'm sure they do have $35 million, or they have obviously 35 less than they did previously. But yes, I think the main bit of this story is, of course, that other companies that are sitting on breaches that they haven't told their shareholders about, or the rest of the market, might want to pay attention, because clearly the SEC is not messing around, and they're keeping an eye on people having good information when they're trading.
I see you're right too. This is the holding corporation that's what's left of Yahoo after the acquisition. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe they don't have $35 million in their spare pants. Let's see. Now, Motherboard, which has just turned into the blog about iPhones, has some more info here. They're running a story talking about the iOS 11.3 update, or 11.3.1 or whatever. This is the update that they are saying is designed maybe to lock out Grey Key, which is this technology used by various law enforcement bodies to unlock locked current model iPhones. And, this kind of dovetails nicely with a story that I spoke about with Pipes last week, where, people pointing to the existence of a technology like Grey Key as being sort of significant in the debate between law enforcement and technology companies about getting access to devices. It's kind of a bit of a red herring because, law enforcement doesn't want an arms race. They just want to be able to open stuff.
Yeah, they just want to get the job done. And that's, I think, the value is why the Grey Keys are fairly popular, because they're not a bug thing. They're a plug in and brute force the PIN code kind of device. The Motherboard story is about a feature that was in one of the beta releases of iOS 11.3, but didn't appear to have made it to the release version so far, called USB restricted mode, which would automatically disable the Lightning connector on your iPhone if you haven't unlocked it in, I think it was a week was the default setting. 7 days, which of course then prevents any of the classes of unlock attacks or jailbreak attacks that require plugging into the Lightning connector, which this one did. It doesn't appear to be in the production release, but it's a pretty good idea. And looking at my iPhone right now, I think I actually would quite like that. So yeah, Apple, hopefully you're going to roll that out. I'll turn it on.
You got to wonder why they didn't roll it out though, right? Because maybe they're thinking this is a bridge too far, and maybe we are finding some sort of status quo here.
Well, yeah, that's a good point, right? Obviously, the police aren't going to stop wanting to unlock iPhones, and if you end up taking away every reasonable avenue they've got, then they're going to end up going with more iOS bugs, right, and more zero-day and more money in that, and that might be a bad thing for Apple. I don't know. I'm not sure what their thinking is, or maybe it's just not quite ready, and we'll see it in a later release.
Yeah, but I mean, that would be seriously kicking up things, right? And you just want, I wonder what's going on here, and I wonder what the motivations are, and I think it's one to watch. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting calculus that, it's not necessarily a straightforward choice about what to do here. And I guess we'll wait and see what they do.
Now, look, the NSA has a new chief, General Paul Nakasone, or Nakasone. I don't know how that's pronounced, but I'm sure we're going to find out soon. Apparently a good pick for the gig, but that's not all that's going down in the US government. I mean, Trump has sent their so-called cyber war strategy off to Congress. I'm presuming Rob Joyce had a lot to do with that document. It's not a public document, but it's been sent away for approval. But the interesting stuff happening in Washington right now is apparently a power struggle brewing at the National Security Council. And, you've got Rob Joyce, who's on his way out. And apparently this guy who might be on the way in, he's named Joshua Steinman. And Cyberscoop is reporting that he spent a lot of his time already just bad-mouthing Joyce and saying that he can do a better job, to which every single source they've interviewed for this piece has just said, no way, this guy's kind of a muppet. I clicked through to his Twitter, and he does have MAGA in his bio. And people don't seem to think particularly highly of the guy. And look, it looks like people are becoming increasingly alarmed that Joyce is on the way out and this guy could be on the way in.
Yeah, I mean, certainly no one seems to have anything nice to say about the guy, or that he is well equipped for the job. And there's a lot of people saying, like, you really do need someone who actually really understands the very complex, not just the technology side, but the sort of the geopolitical implications of all of that technology stuff. And I know when Trump kind of first came in and we saw the first kind of rumblings of cyber policy stuff out of the US government, I think on the show we said, like, this seems weirdly sensible. Like, this is not messed up, which was because Rob Joyce. And I guess, like, this kind of now makes more sense that you would replace the competent guy with, a useless crony yes man who doesn't know what he's doing. And, that now actually the narrative makes more sense, right? And things have, restored to the balance that we would expect, rather than, there being someone sensible in charge of the stuff in the Trump White House. Like, I mean, the whole kind of position of the, national security, new national security advisor and the kind of changes up there, I mean, are alarming, full stop. And this is just kind of one more piece of that. Like, we don't really want to see, someone getting all cyber gung-ho without understanding what it means for everybody else, or indeed for America. So,
yeah,
it is alarming.
Yeah, it is. So let's hope something happens there and that doesn't progress. But there we go. We got some Kaspersky news here. Kaspersky Lab has been banned apparently from advertising on Twitter, which I think is kind of weird, right? And Twitter has cited the US government ban. But I would really hope there's more to this and they're making this decision based on more than just that, because that seems, pretty severe.
Yeah, because Twitter has said that, the decision is, their spokesman said, the decision is based on our determination that Kaspersky Labs operates using a business model that inherently conflicts with acceptable Twitter ads business practices. Like, what does that mean? Like, they sell antivirus software. That seems like a reasonable business model. I mean, whether or not they're a puppet of their host government, I guess, is another conversation. But it doesn't.
You wonder if they got a briefing, right? And if they did get a briefing, why can't we see anything from the US government saying we believe they're bad? You don't even need to say what the evidence is, but actually come out with an official assessment that says they're doing the wrong thing. And they have not done that.
Yeah, and you got to feel, I mean, it's hard not to feel bad for all the good people that do work at Kaspersky and do good technical work, because, you really feel like they're being squished in the middle of the politics. I mean, I guess I don't know. That's my opinion based on, not much inside knowledge, of course. But, I mean, I feel bad for them. And, I'm sure the people at Kaspersky are just, smacking their head against the table or going, oh, for God's sake, what now every morning? So
yeah, well, I mean, that's not the end of it this week. Kaspersky is apparently facing the prospect of US government sanctions.
That would certainly be an interesting escalation, because, I mean, all of the previous stuff has been really about, American government organizations not using Kaspersky. And, we've seen some fallout from that in terms of, like, Best Buy not putting it on the shelves or whatever. But, fallout for the rest of the world hasn't necessarily been that big a deal. But if they get added to, the kind of international sanctions arrangements that exist, then that could spread much farther afield than just the US government, which, I mean, I guess at some point the value of Kaspersky to the Russian government, if they are in fact tools of the Russian government, is that it is used in a bunch of places. And at some point those two will come into tension and, then what happens,
Yeah, I'm really just waiting for the US government to actually put its money where its mouth is. And instead of just slapping sanctions on them, tell us why.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Now a bit of news that kind of slipped by and no one noticed it. I picked it up on a sort of private newsletter that I'm on. Is that Microsoft has released this thing called Azure Sphere, which is an IoT play which solves an awful lot of problems. And it looks, this is big news, right? I'm surprised no one's really picked it up. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so at RSA, Microsoft announced this Azure Sphere IoT thing, and essentially it's a combination of an embedded, microcontroller solution, microprocessor with, embedded OS and real-time components. Interestingly, based on Linux kernel, it does appear rather than Windows kernel. But plus a bunch of cloud bits, plus the operating system that runs on the on the microprocessor, all kind of tied together, pre-integrated with a bunch of standards around how you use it, what you use it for, how it communicates, how it authenticates itself, presumably how it updates itself securely. So all of the plumbing required to build IoT gadgets in a way that isn't rubbish. And I think this is. And of course also all the development tools. That's the thing that Microsoft is really good at doing, is building the development ecosystem around, their platforms to make it easy for developers to use what they already know and to roll out really easily. And I guess the goal here is for people making IoT rubbish to buy an off-the-shelf, toolkit from Microsoft to put in their devices and to develop and to run their cloud environment in and to run all the backend in, obviously then selling a bunch more Microsoft services in the process. But then you end up with a platform that's actually well engineered and well designed and isn't rubbish. And I think this is.
Who better than Microsoft to do this, right? Like they've just come and said, okay, IoT is rubbish. Here's an entire platform. Use this, and it looks pretty good.
Yeah, and I think, they've got a bunch of, Microsoft does have really good engineers, and there's a bunch of stuff, their experiences with all the Xbox platforms, obviously running Azure as it is, and some of their other embedded Windows stuff. Like, they do understand this stuff. And I think the other really important thing is that all of the other IoT, if you're an IoT vendor, like you're selling IoT widgets, you're really not going to have anything like the dedication and the resource that Microsoft has put into this.
Yeah.
You're going to have 4 or 5 guys doing some embedded Linux crap, and they'll throw together something rubbish, invent their own update scheme that runs in the clear and is terrible, and they'll get all of your IP cameras that you ever sold owned 5 years down the track and ruin the company. Whereas Microsoft, they are betting on this, and they will have done a good job. Yeah, I think this is
they will
really
have,
good,
and I think it's not going to cover the whole spectrum. I've got an sponsor interview coming up with Stephen Ridley of Sanrio, and they're big on the IoT security space, and I can't wait to get his thoughts on this because they've done some stuff around this as well, and I'll be curious, to hear his take on where this is going to work and where it's not going to work, and whether or not that's going to be an edge case or whether this only applies to certain classes of devices and what sort of percentage of the ecosystem this framework can be used for. But it's very interesting news. I got some news here from a blog called Keen Security Labs blog. They're talking about a bunch of VMware escapes. Are these legit?
Oh, yeah. So this is Keen Labs. I think they're out of China. They did a bunch of the VMware escapes at the last Pwn to Own, but they've written up a blog post talking about some of their VMware guest to host bugs. They've got all of the exploit code up there as well, which is really nice. They talk through, I think, 3 different techniques that they've used to get out of guest into the host. So yes, if you want to keep up with the state of the art of hacking VMware, then totally worth the read. The interesting thing I got out of this was that one of the bugs that they got, it turned out that everybody who showed up to Pwn to Own 2017 to do the VMware escape, all of them turned up with one of these bugs that turned out to be really discoverable through fuzzing, and they all had the same bug, which is pretty funny. But yeah. Definitely
makes you wonder who else might have had it before then, huh?
Well, gee, I wonder, right? Yeah.
And I got this one. This is our last story for the week. I got this one from Casey Ellis's Twitter feed because he was tweeting about this one. But apparently you can spoof a cell network. You can spoof a GSM network just by pumping the right stuff through a USB to VGA adapter. Tell us about this.
Yeah, so someone's done the hard work to turn this USB 3 to VGA dongle into a transmit-capable software-defined radio, which on one hand sounds insane and crazy. On the other hand, anything is a radio if you can oscillate it right and has the right kind of, electrical characteristics. So in that respect, it's not,
Yeah, but what sort of, I mean, how gimmicky is this? Does it have a range of like 50 centimeters or is it like better than that?
Yeah, so obviously the range is completely rubbish. I'm not sure quite how rubbish. I imagine it's going to depend whether you're transmitting in GPS frequencies or GSM or whatever else. Obviously people are going to turn this into, here's the sorts of, stick some wires in the VGA holes of this length and you'll get better performance kind of thing. But it's a really good illustration of the general class of ability to turn almost anything into a transmitter. I mean, we've seen people do it with the lights in people's keyboards, like you can PWM those fast enough and you can transmit data out. And, there's been, lots of stories over the years of people using this kind of stuff to jump air gaps. There was one that went past this week where some guy was using, using this kind of technique to exfil Bitcoin keys off cold wallets and stuff, just by, compromising the cold wallet and then transmitting through, lines on the Raspberry Pi or whatever, and then receiving them somewhere else with some headphones on a mobile phone. So yeah, I mean, this is not an unusual thing if you're into layer zero radio stuff. But yeah, really cool to see it written up and in this case, implemented by the Osmocom team. So yay, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that whole thing about getting private keys out of, air-gapped wallets. We've linked through to a story on that in this week's show notes. And in fact, there's quite a few stories that we skipped over this week just because we didn't have time to get to them. So, if you want to see the InfoSec news that we didn't have time to speak about, do check out this week's show notes. But that's it for this week's news. Adam, thanks a lot for joining us. It's great to have you back on deck, and we'll chat to you again next week.
Yeah, lots of fun, and I look forward to talking to you then.
That was Adam Boileau there. Big thanks to him for that. Okay, it is time for this week's feature interview now, and I didn't do this one. Risky Business contributing reporter Brian Donahue filed this report. Brian is an ex-threat poster who lives in the DC area, and a recent report published by the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission titled Supply Chain Vulnerabilities from China in US Federal Information and Communications Technology caught his eye. It's a pretty long read and does a nice job of laying out what the issues and risks are when it comes to the world being very, very dependent on technology designed and manufactured in China. And it's a really interesting conundrum. China has been very successful at stimulating R&D locally. So I think you'd be hard-pressed finding a telco or serious manufacturer anywhere that doesn't rely on either Chinese components or, full turnkey Chinese solutions. But the risks that come with this state of affairs aren't really well understood. And sure, there are the obvious risks, like a Chinese vendor being forced to build a backdoor into their hardware or software for use by Chinese C&E operators. But there are more subtle risks and less understood risks as well. Like, could the staff of various Chinese companies pose a risk to the security of the countries where they're working to deploy and manage Chinese gear? Could these Chinese companies wind up giving the Chinese government sensitive details about various deployments or, some of the architectures and designs? Could they give the government information on those designs and architectures that give them an offensive security edge and angle? The point is, we don't really know what these risks look like. It's already very difficult for anyone to know what the supply chain looks like already today. Some major US companies will, publish lists of their top 10 or top 100 suppliers, but others don't publish those lists at all. And of course, those lists change pretty much day to day. And, how far would transparency even get us if all of these companies supplied lists of all of their suppliers? Jennifer Bisegli is the CEO of Interos, the company that prepared the report for the US government. And Brian Donahue sat down with her at their offices to talk through China's supply chain risks. And he started off by asking her if we even know where the constituent parts of our IT systems actually come from. Here's what she said.
So the answer is no, but I'd also like to stress that a couple things. One is when we're talking about supply chain, we're really talking about much more of a broader definition, from the products and services being made to the other business relationships, from distribution networks, logistics, to financial relationships, to mentoring relationships, to mergers and acquisition. There's a much larger conversation to be had. The other point that we brought out in the report is that I don't know that industry really needs to publish their list, because if we think about the way that industry functions, we're all about competition. We're all about innovation. We're all about getting the best product or service to our customers. And so the idea of publishing full supplier lists, they become static and outdated as soon as they become published. I think that what we really stressed to the commission and to all the conversations we've had is that it's much more important, in our opinion, that folks understand where they're vulnerable, what the concern is based on the products or services or business partnerships that they're entering into or buying, and then they're able to communicate that to their business partners, which hopefully and inherently raises the security posture. It's not about trying to control the supply chain, because you can't do that in a multi-tiered global economy if you want to take advantage of good pricing and innovation, but it's really the idea of understanding where you're vulnerable and having this forward-leaning security posture, which we don't currently have right now.
So controlling the supply chain is probably impossible, and forcing companies to be completely transparent about their supply chain is, as you just said, not going to solve this problem. But the report seems to insinuate pretty heavily that companies are intentionally obfuscating their supply chain. So is this something that they should be doing?
So the answer is no. At the same time, I think if you have an informed customer, whether that's the federal government or if you think about any public or private sector organization is ultimately the customer of someone else, if you understand where your risk concerns are and where you're vulnerable, being able to have that conversation with your next tier business partner or supplier, that's really the way to win this game. It's not trying to lock things down, because all that does is drive costs up. It's really understanding and owning your own risk posture, which we don't see a lot of that happening right now.
So, I mean, at what level of granularity do we want to be able to track the supply chain of electronics and computer devices that are being used in the federal government? Do we want to be able to figure out the supply chain of every CCTV camera that's used on a federal network? Do we want to know where the parts of the president's iPhone were made? Or is there some other sort of calculus that we want to be doing in regards to sort of locating the sources of all of the componentry and the computers we're using?
Yeah, I think what we tried to stress is it really depends on the level of concern or the level of consequence that's going to occur because of that product or service that you're buying. So if I'm looking at commercial technology, and before you mentioned the Dells of the world and the HP, I'm not as concerned about their 6-tier supplier as long as I've been able to articulate to HP or Dell, these are my security concerns. Their job is to mitigate that through the tiers. That is their job. That's how they stay innovative. That's how they get the purchasing power that they have. On the other hand, if I'm buying something very specific that's created for critical infrastructure or national security systems, and I want to pay the additional cost that it will definitely drive into the market to control that, then it's worth it. But it's really understanding the level of rigor of risk management that needs to be applied, and that needs to be commensurate based on how much time and money you're willing to spend based on that consequence.
At the end of the day, do we really understand our exposure in terms of the supply chain?
Our answer is no in many cases, and that's exactly why this report has really gotten everybody's attention, because we're bringing up things that shouldn't be a surprise. And before we started taping this conversation, we talked about what happened at Facebook. A lot of these things shouldn't be a surprise, just people weren't paying attention to it before. And this comes under the title of supply chain risk management. And I can tell you again, of being in the industry for so long, it doesn't come across as a very exciting topic. But when you realize that this is all about the business relationships that you have in this global economy, and the fact that you don't necessarily have the transparency or visibility to understand where real risk and impact is coming to you until it really matters or to really impacts you, then it becomes important.
So let's change gears a little bit here. Why China?
So China, for two main reasons. One is that there was already a law that multiple agencies had to do supply chain risk management programs, and China was one of the countries that they were concerned about. So this was a little bit of an update to that. The second piece of that was the concept of Internet of Things and 5G. And there's a lot of discussion right now on the global stage about the standards around 5G and the fact that China is trying to take a forward lean and a forward posture and control where the standards come from, which based on the fact that they have a published approach to how they affect their political and their economic position, it's caused a lot of countries concern because the politics are too tied to their manufacturing. And if you think about a third point, which is almost all of the world's technology is manufactured in China, it's caused great concern through a lot of countries.
Is it right to be punishing China for having an effective government policy that's stimulated the information and communication tech research and development and manufacturing in that country? I mean, as you guys say in the report, China didn't land as this major nexus for global supply chain and global manufacturing by accident. I mean, they very much did it by design.
I think I'd take the approach that given the fact that buying commercial technology, we're going to have to deal with China, I think it is beholden upon us as a country as well as individual private sector consumers to make sure that we understand what our vulnerabilities are and how are we going to protect those things. And I think if we focus on those things versus which country is doing the right or wrong thing economically, we'll be in a safer position.
Is it even going to be feasible, though, to stay focused on China here for a minute? Is it even feasible to lock Chinese manufacturers out of U.S. infrastructure or even just U.S. technology builds at this point?
So I think it gets very difficult, and it gets very difficult for two reasons. One, because it limits the opportunity for competition based on where major manufacturing is for commercial technology. The second piece is when you limit competition, things just naturally get more expensive. And so we used to do a lot of the production here in the United States, and we now know that most of it is overseas. We used to have things called foundries where we found out they were too expensive, so they've gone back overseas. So I think as a country, you kind of have a couple, and not just the federal government, but all the private sector organizations here as well. And I truly believe this is a business problem to solve. It's not a governmental problem to solve. I think you have a couple opportunities here. Again, one is identifying where you're vulnerable, where the consequences are, and how do you put in solid risk management programs that partner and do information sharing with your industry partners to make sure that you're lowering the risk for all. The alternative is that you start trying to control manufacturing, and not just in the United States, but on a global level, and you just drive your costs up.
Yeah, well, that was another question I was going to ask is this sort of shady supply chain just the cost of being able to acquire relatively cheap electronics?
So I wouldn't, in my opinion, I wouldn't call it shady. I would say that it's just the nature of being in a global economy and having to deal with countries and different manufacturing processes around the world. And the idea is that whatever company you're buying from, the hope is that they're controlling their manufacturing processes, that there are standards included. But that's, again, why I bring up the point. If we don't understand where our concerns are, if we don't understand the level of service that we need from our supplier base, if we don't understand the level of functioning that product we're buying has to be at, and we're not communicating that, then it doesn't matter where these things are manufactured, we're going to get bit every time.
Can this supply chain problem be fixed by getting the Chinese government to give up some of its total control and oversight over local vendors there? And the reason I'm asking this is because there's been a lot of talk about, trade war this and bungled policy that over the president's remarks about creating sort of tariffs on steel. So my concern is that this is just going to be a much bigger version of that, and we're going to get trade war and, bad policy thrown around all over the place if the federal government tries to throw its weight behind regulations that would sort of limit China's position in the supply chain. Do you think that that's a fair assessment?
So we don't. And again, we're real big fans of working with organizations, whether it be the federal government or the private sector, to understand what's the mission that they're trying to accomplish, why are they in business, where the risks are, where the risks are coming from, and how they need to be mitigated. Again, it's not a country conversation for us. It's truly a 101 risk management conversation. And if you say that based on what we're buying from China causes a concern, then you seek alternative sources of supplies. We'd rather approach it from that versus starting to blacklist countries.
incentives too good for U.S. companies to move their manufacturing out of China? I mean, these companies are beholden to their boards. I'm personally not convinced that most of these boards really care that much about, where their processor chips are made when the alternative is a massive increase in production spending.
I think it's a really great point, and I think it really drives home the point that this is a business problem to be solved. As much as it's a national security concern from the federal government, it truly is a business discussion. And what we're actually seeing is that boards and C-suites are really understanding more that this is a problem that they need to be aware of. And if you think about the awakening that they had from a cybersecurity concern, you're now seeing that supply chain risk is becoming part of that same conversation.
One of the reasons that we really wanted to talk to you guys was because there's a couple of things happening in the news recently that really tie into this supply chain stuff. One is that the National Cybersecurity Center in the United Kingdom recently said, in essence, that ZTE equipment deployments in the UK are risks that can't really be mitigated. So obviously, the initial question is, did you see this report? And if you did, have we already gone too far down this road in the United States, particularly with the United States government?
So I never think you're too far. It's always time to get started, and it's not very difficult to get started. I do think you brought up a great example of a country that did figure out where they were vulnerable and put together a risk management program around that vulnerability. So the fact that they actually did stand up this lab, in the lab they're looking for where they're exposed and what mitigations they need to put in place, and then they're doing something about it, I think should be commended.
So I feel like maybe we have an opportunity to sort of go down a road like that with the development of the 5G network for mobile carriers in the United States. To lead into this is our second sort of topical news story we're going to dive into here. There was a dust-up in the White House in January or February over leaked PowerPoint slides from a member of the National Security Council advocating for a federal takeover of the deployment of the country's 5G mobile network. So this obviously didn't jive with the purportedly laissez-faire White House, so they removed the Air Force general who had been pushing the idea. Without getting too political here, there's a lot of people in the U.S. government that when you say government takeover, they hear Bolshevik revolution. Is this sort of a realistic way to solve this problem?
It's really not, in our opinion. And I go back to, if folks understood where they were vulnerable, it's really this simple, and I feel like I'm being very redundant during this conversation, but it's understanding where you're vulnerable and how to mitigate those things. And so during the hearing with the commission a few weeks ago, the 5G network was a big deal. And from our standpoint, having some sort of national risk management posture, national strategy around risk management, and getting involved in the standards of 5G versus trying to control from a governmental standpoint, it really allows for the private sector to do what they do best. And I think that's what we need to focus on.
Speaking of focus, do you think that there's not enough attention being paid to the rollout of the 5G mobile networks? So should we, when I say we, I mean, the federal government, of course, but also private sector companies, the media, security practitioners, should we be paying more attention to how we roll out 5G in the U.S.?
So once again, I think 5G is just an example of a technology. And I think from a government standpoint, I think the government should do what they do best, which is setting a governance framework, but not being prescriptive about how industry should function within it. And that industry should focus on what they do best, which is innovation, information sharing, the global economy. And the idea there, when the two things come together, you have an increased security posture. I do think that we're really missing the mark. As much as we're all looking to kind of blame other countries and focus on other countries, it really comes back to all of us in the public and the private sector, really focusing on how to protect what we have, whether it be intellectual property or completion of mission. We're very focused on the idea of new technologies and enterprise technologies and purchasing more because we think that's going to solve all of our cybersecurity concerns. But at the same time, we're not really focused on understanding the problems as they come into our organization, leveraging automation, leveraging advanced analytics to understand and continuously monitor the relationships that we're entering into that I really think is going to increase our security posture.
That was Brian Donahue interviewing Jennifer Bisegli of Interos there. Big thanks to both of them for that. Okay, this week's show is brought to you by NetSparker. NetSparker is a web app testing tool with a heavy focus on automation and scale. And I guess it started off more as a tool to help pen testers, and it's kind of evolved from there. And these days, NetSparker is all about doing, as I mentioned, testing at massive scale. And, their line is that many organizations actually have like over 1,000 web apps running within their organization. And that can be everything from, your production boxes, but also anything running on your internal network that has a web interface, any web APIs that might be on your network, third-party apps, appliance boxes, that sort of stuff. And of course, also stuff that you might not necessarily know about on your public ranges. So over the last few years, they've been focusing on this issue of scale, and the idea being, hey, you can unleash their scanner on your environment and find the most obvious issues, but across many, many, many different applications. And they've got some nifty ideas here. They've got a feature called proof-based scanning, where it will actually exploit some bug classes like SQL injection, the idea being that they can minimize false positives that way. And they've also cloudified their scanner. So if you want to let it loose on your internal network, you can just install an agent that connects it to their cloud scanner, basically. So, some interesting stuff happening with NetSparker over the last few years. So NetSparker has just raised $40 million in a Series A. And I think, really, as you're going to hear, their priority and what they're going to do with that money is try to end this perception that these scanners are a tool for pen testers. NetSparker's founder and head honcho, Faru Mavituna, he joined me to talk about the raise and what might happen in this market segment and where he wants this market segment to go. Here he is.
How do you secure hundreds or thousands of web applications, web services, APIs? So this has been one of the biggest problems in web application security for the last maybe couple of years, starting from almost 4 years ago. But in the last 1-2 years, it reached to a peak where there are so many organizations has hundreds or thousands of applications. And when we talk to them, we ask them the question straight out, like, what do you do today? There is no answer. So none of them can say, I've got this kind of application security program that I am happy with. None of them comes even close to that answer. So we predicted the raise, and it was kind of obvious, about 4 or 5 years ago. If you are in application security, it was obvious that organizations will have tons of applications, not only a couple of. So we started to build NetSparker Cloud, and in 2017, we came to a point where we have this great technology, and now the biggest question is, can we make the most out of it? Because yes, we got a good product. Yes, we have so many customers, right? But what I wanted to have, I'm in the right place with the right product, and I want to own this market, be the de facto standard for the future, not only today. So that was the reason and the background on why we wanted to raise. And going back to your original question, what are we going to do with the money, is effectively securing our position for the future term, investing more into research and development, investing a lot into marketing, sales, expansion. For example, we are very strong in North America, but there's all this rest of the world that we want to get better, better visibility in different markets.
Look, as part of any raise, right, like sales and marketing is always going to be a big part of that. But the thing that stuck out to me is $40 million. I mean, that's a serious round, right? And we've seen previously rounds like that have gone to the companies that are trying to solve application security problems more at the development phase. I'm thinking of, companies like Veracode, for example. So it's unusual. I mean, I can't think of a comparable raise that's gone to a company that does scanning technology that's really NetSparker is in the finding the problems part of the business rather than the fixing the development solutions part of the business, right? So this is certainly a new development in the industry.
Well, that is correct. But I think that's part of the problem with the industry, What we have done, we have invested historically at an enterprise level in this buying decision maker level. We constantly spent money into technologies. Either we spent money into stuff like web application firewalls, right? A big amount of money. where in theory it solves everything. In practice, it doesn't solve almost anything. It's just additional small layer in security. I don't even mean to undermine web. What I mean, what happened is consumer thinks they're going to buy web application firewall and they will be set, right? Because, that's an easy sell and that's an easy buy. You say, I buy this solution and all of my problems go away, but obviously it doesn't. So again, like in the development, a static source code analysis or various other solutions, network security solutions, similar problems, right? What we have seen is in the development stage, there is a huge problem. In development, you need to be secure. And that's why we also, do a lot of in SDLC now. We have native plugins to integrate into SDLC progress. It's a huge part of the problem. But when you go to an enterprise, you understand their application security problems is not one point problem. So the way we implement the web application security is all around. It's starting from software development lifecycle, but it also reaches to the third-party applications, reaches to the legacy applications and all the production. And the problem is, right, you make your secure development secure, okay, but you still have tons of third-party applications. You still have tons of legacy applications. And none of the solutions today provide that scale.
Now we spoke about this last time you were on the show. We spoke about this, about how organizations might have like 1,000 web applications and they don't even necessarily know that they have that many. And that could be anything from some sort of network appliance, which has a web application front end on it, to, third-party stuff, like whether that's, just whatever web server is set up on the internal network to handle whatever function. And I do see what you mean about a gap there, because you're not gonna buy Signal Sciences and integrate it with all of your third-party apps, because that would be insane, right? So I certainly see the need for especially in large enterprise, like a type of scalable scanning that can identify problems, risks, vulnerabilities, things like that. But I guess your backers are certainly seeing that need as well. But do you think the market is really ready for that, like $40 million ready for that, for you to go in there and really try to turn this into a InfoSec, like an enterprise InfoSec staple? Because that's what you're going to have to do when you raise that sort of money, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the market is more than ready. The biggest problem with the market is kind of perception of the market. Market thinks dynamic application security testing is not a big deal, right? And they got a good reason to believe to do that. And I'm going to kind of blame the industry for it. 9 years ago, when I started the company, it was a funny time, right? So we came out, and the reason I started developing NetSparker, it was my own personal frustration. I was a pen tester doing applications day in and day out. That's all I did. I was a very app security focused person. And I'm using all these tools, and majority of them today still available, though majority of them also acquired by larger organizations and not doing well compared to their independent states. Anyway, so the problem was consistently you were getting false positives and they were falling short on finding even simplest vulnerabilities and so many other bunch of issues, right? And funny enough, in our first year, there was this third-party benchmark. And we put NetSparker on third-party benchmark, and it did better than almost 90% of all the commercial tools. Now, this is funny. Why would a tool hasn't reached maturity can still be better than majority of the commercial tools? So there was the problem with the market. All the players in the game got stale, didn't innovate, and they kind of like, okay, people are buying, and this is what I'm selling. And there's no need to go any further because there's no competition.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, there's been so many that have just withered on the vine, right? Like I certainly hear you on that, but we've never seen anyone obviously NetSpark is around and has been around for a while, and you do have competitors, and you're all there in that niche, right? Like I know that pen testers will use your software, organizations will use it internally, but it's still kind of a niche, right? And it seems like what you're trying to do now is to go mainstream, and that's always a pretty steep hill for a technology that might be niche within a niche.
I agree. That's definitely a niche. But that's the part of the problem, I believe. It is a niche because we as an industry, dust industry, let's say, we couldn't prove the value of dust in mainstream. And that's what we have been trying to do in NetSparker. We can make this dust a tool that can find vulnerabilities that majority of the security guys cannot. Your average pen tester cannot find vulnerabilities, but NetSparker can. And then when it finds vulnerabilities, it can prove they do exist, just like your pen tester, not give you false positive, gives you the proof that the vulnerability actually exists and completely automatically. And when it fails, it doesn't blame the consumer. It doesn't blame the user because they didn't configure it right, So these were the biggest problems. You use one of these tools, you don't get the good results, and the vendor comes back to you and say, look, you didn't configure it right. Okay, now how do I get value out of this product? So it became something either only finding low-hanging fruit, not finding something good enough, and never can help enough or replace a security tester. It's not a replacement for a security tester, but it's a fantastic process to make their job better.
Farouk Mavatuna, it's always a pleasure to speak to you, and congratulations on raising 40 million clams. That's a lot of dollaroos. Best of luck with your plans, and I'll look forward to speaking to you again.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. Thank you.
That was Farouk Mavatuna of NetSparker there, talking about his company's Series A raise of $40 million. Big thanks to NetSparker for its support of the Risky Business podcast, and you can find them, of course, at netsparker.com. And that is it for this week's show. I do hope you've enjoyed it. Until next week, I've been Patrick Gray. Thanks for listening.